And good evening, everybody. Hello, and welcome to Chilliteracy. Happy Wednesday! Yay, Wednesday! How is everybody doing? I hope we're all well. Hello to everyone. Hello, Andy Pants. Hope you're well. Nice pun. Thank you very much for the resub. Lady Mephistopheles, good time zone to you too. Andy Pants, yeah, I'm doing all right, thank you. Yeah, not too bad. Had a lovely weekend last weekend, so all is good. Lynn, hello, welcome. Hope you're doing well. You're on the slightly better side of mediocre this week, Lady Mephistopheles. That is good. But you're so ready for it to be over too. Yeah. Well, sending all the good vibes. Also, hello, Angeline. Hello and good time zone. Apparently still alive after sneaking in a 30-minute nap on your lunch break. Nice. That is a good time to have a nap. The other thing. Also, hello, Salad. Greetings. Oh, everybody's in. You have a dentist appointment tomorrow and then your new fridge is being delivered on Friday. Well, for the dentist appointment, because I don't like dentists. Dentists are there. And I hope new fridge is good. I hope it works. And other things. It means you need to empty out and clean the old one. Oh, yeah, good point. That is always a bit of a faff. So yeah, at least I guess it's not as bad as like having to defrost a freezer. I don't know, I guess. You're slightly robotic, Lynn, with having done your neck in. Oh no. Ugh, that sucks. I hope that improves soon. And Harpress with the raid. My goodness me, everybody's coming in. Thank you very much, Harpress. I hope you are well. I hope your stream went well. And yeah, welcome in. Oh, you will like the fact that Sam and I played a demo of a game called, I want to say it was Flutter Away. That might be wrong, but it had capybaras in it. So we thought of you. Thought you'd appreciate. It's a fridge freezer, so that will also be happening. No. We'll have fun with that, because defrosting a freezer is always great. The gang is indeed all here. Yes. Welcome in. I hope we are all doing well. Harperus. Oh wow, you have a big raider tag. The stream was cute. Good. And you sang a Kraken lullaby by Talis Kimberly. It was very sweet and eldritch. Ooh, that sounds good. That sounds very good. Ray Tracer. Hello, you got left behind by the Heart Raid. Well, welcome in. It's nice to see you. Many tentacles were had. Maybe rephrase that. Capybaras are always good. Yeah, agreed. But yes, welcome in all you lovely, lovely people. Tonight we shall be reading 2 short stories, because they are... That should be enough to fill the time. We have a short story by Mr. Wilkie Collins, who we have read one of. I have read one from before, which was, if any of you were around, and if the words like corkscrew top bed ring a bell, that was him. And we've also got Mary Molesworth, who I don't think I've read any of before. So yes, lol. Yeah, that fun story that was mildly disconcerting. Speaking of capybaras, there's a capybara thing in London. You might need to elucidate a little bit, because thing could mean anything. Is there a giant capybara statue? Is there a capybara party? Does everybody have to dress up as a capybara for a day? That's about as much as I can think of. Also, do let me know if the audio is all good, because I'm currently on Sam's setup, so if I am quiet or loud or stuff, then do let me know. That's what we shared with Harper's earlier. Oh, it's a TikTok link though. Why? You sound good? Marvellous. Thank you very much. Molesworth is indeed a very Dickensian sounding name. Isn't it? Isn't Adrian Molesworth? Isn't that a book about a... I can't remember. Audio is fine. Fab. Well, apparently my phone is refusing to load chat, so I'm not going to click on that link. Sorry. I will click on it later, probably. Or get Sam to. One of the two. Sounds good. Marvellous. I'm glad everything sounds good. We had a bit of rain earlier, which would have been highly appropriate for the stream, as we always have our rain sound effect, but nope. Lasted all of 10 seconds and then went, nah, you know what, maybe not. Professional link clicker, Sam. That is his actual official title. Yeah. That's it. Excuse me. But yes. Do I have anything more to say? For those of you who are interested in our Bandcamp, we have, I think last week we put up some whatchamacallem, William Hope Hodgson Tales of the Weird, which are like sea stories that are fun and cool and weird. So if you fancy going to listen to them, do head on over to our Bandcamp. There is the link. You've had your favourite type of weather today, about 20 degrees and slight overcast. Ooh, yeah, that's quite nice. That's kind of what we've had here as well. Yeah, again, sort of been threatening to rain a bit. But yeah, it's not too bad. Excuse me. Oh. Last weekend was not significantly warmer, like 5 or so degrees warmer. There's more smoke coming your way tomorrow, Ray Tracer. No. And Andy Pants got to Kentucky today, visibly grey and hazy this morning. Ugh. That sucks. I'm sorry. Yeah, since we're not yet reading, you're going to plug... Is that a link to my thing, Lady Mephistopheles? What is it? You and links, dearie me. Well, unfortunately, yes it is, okay. Unfortunately for you, there is already today's first story pinned on the top of the chat, so raspberries. That's going to stay there. That's not moving. Not happening. But thank you very much. That's very kind of you. You had a lovely soft rain all day, very refreshing. Ooh, that's always good. I like that. Good like soft drizzle, summer drizzle. Good stuff. The plants also would like that. All my recent music has been so lovely. Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. Yeah, thought I should, put some more stuff on my YouTube, given that there was about, I think, like 4 videos on there. I was like, oh, maybe I should do more with that. So, yeah, I've been doing some. Just have to pop it in chat every so often when it scrolls too far. I'll scream, no, people. But I'm glad you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Gives you goosebumps. It is an amazing... If you haven't heard the original song, absolutely go and listen to it. It's Nancy Kerr and James Fagan. And it's beautiful. It's really nice. I feel like Harper's would like, because it's about a Selkie, or from a Selkie's point of view. So it's all fun and folkloric and all of that good stuff. But yeah, it's a lovely song. I do like it. But I was actually commissioned by a friend to do an arrangement of that for women's choir, and so I did that, and then I was like, hey, you know what, this could do with some doots, and sort of not rearranged it exactly, but added some more bits and rejigged it a bit to fit with some doots. So yeah, you do know that song, Lovey? Yeah, I thought you probably would. Doots are always welcome. Yes, here. Strong agree, but I feel like I'm sort of obliged to say that. But anyway, so yeah, we've got two stories today. I think we're going to read the longer one first. So the break might be a little bit later than usual. Not sure. Oh, you know it because I pointed you towards it. Oh, well, there we go. Whoops. Do you do only trumpet doots or other doots too? By other doots, I assume you mean like things like trombone and French horn and things, maybe? I'm not sure. But no, I just do trumpet because the vast majority of like professional brass musicians or professional classical musicians in general tend to stick to one instrument, and that instrument's kind of, I don't know, in trumpet, because there are several different types of trumpet, like there's trumpets in different keys, basically. It's like harpers having different harps. It's the same instrument, but in different kind of formats. So I think I have about 7 different trumpets, and including a flugelhorn there. But no, I don't play any other dutes, because it kind of messes your embouchure up a little bit. And yeah, you kind of have to focus on one, really. But I have tried other dutes. I have tried tuba, which was highly entertaining because it's about the size of me. I have tried trombone. I have tried French horn. French horn's fun. I think I've tried tenor horn? I think I've tried tenor horn. Yeah, it's fun. But you don't actually know what a flugelhorn is. Possibly the best name of any instrument. I know, it's great. Flugelhorn, I think literally means like winged horn. I think. And I think flugel also is like a name for a grand piano, possibly, in German, because it's like the shape of a wing. I may be wrong, anyone who's German can correct me on that, but I thought that's what I heard many years ago. But a flugelhorn it's same pitch as a trumpet, same key as a trumpet. It's a brass band instrument predominantly, and is just like really... Flugel does mean wing. Yeah, nailed it. And it's a very mellow sound. It's like a cross between means like a cross between like French horn and trumpet in terms of sound. It's very, very mellow, very warm. Wikipedia. The German word flugel means wing or flank in English. In early 18th century Germany, a ducal hunt... Oh, yeah. Duke. Okay. Ducal hunt leader known as a Flugelmeister blew the flugelhorn, a large semicircular brass or silver valveless horn, to direct the wings of the hunt. Ha! That's cool. Yeah, so that's where that's come from, which is very cool. I didn't actually know that bit, so thank you, Andy, for looking up on Wikipedia. Yes, thank you very much. Right, shall we? I think we shall. Shall we read some stories? Let's read some stories. So, sorry if that clap was loud. I felt it warranted. A clap and a rubbing of hands. So, yeah, if we're all sitting comfortably, I hope you all have some kind of beverage of some description. Remember to hydrate and all of that if it's warm. And are sitting, standing, lying, upside down, whatever, comfortably. Don't really know how you'd be upside down comfortably. I'm tired, can you tell? But yes, let us begin with The Lady of Glenwith Grange by Wilkie Collins. Prologue. My practice in the art of portrait painting, if it has done nothing else, has at least fitted me to turn my talents, such as they are, to a great variety of uses. I have not only taken the likenesses of men, women, and children, but have also extended the range of my brush, under stress of circumstances, to horses, dogs, houses, and in one case even to a bull, the terror and glory of his parish, and the most truculent sitter I ever had. The beast was appropriately named Thunder and Lightning, and was the property of a gentleman farmer named Garthwaite, a distant connection of my wife's family. How it was that I escaped being gored to death before I had finished my picture is more than I can explain to this day. Thunder and Lightning resented the very sight of me and my colour box, as if he viewed the taking of his likeness in the light of a personal insult. It required 2 men to coax him, while a third held him by a ring in his nostrils before I could venture on beginning to work. Even then, he always lashed his tail and jerked his huge head, and rolled his fiery eyes with a devouring anxiety to have me on his horns for daring to sit down quietly and look at him. Never, I can honestly say, did I feel more heartily grateful for the blessings of soundness of limb and wholeness of skin than when I had completed the picture of the bull. One morning, when I had but little more than half done my unwelcome task, my friend and I were met on our way to the bull's stable by the farm bailiff, who informed us gravely that Thunder and Lightning was just then in such an especially surly state of temper as to render it quite unsafe for me to think of painting him. I looked inquiringly at Mr. Garthwaite, who smiled with an air of comic resignation, and said, Very well, then. We have nothing for it but to wait till tomorrow. What do you say to a morning's fishing, Mr. Kirby, now that my bull's bad temper has given us a holiday? I replied, with perfect truth, that I knew nothing about fishing. But Mr. Garthwaite, who was as ardent an angler in his way as Isaac Walton himself, was not to be appeased even by the best of excuses. "It is never too late to learn," cried he. "I will make a fisherman of you in no time, if you will only attend to my directions." It was impossible for me to make any more apologies without the risk of appearing discourteous. So I thanked my host for his friendly intentions, and with some secret misgivings accepted the first fishing rod that he put into my hands. "We shall soon get there," said Mr. Garthwaite. "I am taking you to the best mill stream in the neighbourhood." It was all one to me whether we got there soon or late, and whether the stream was good or bad. However, I did my best to conceal my unsportsmanlike apathy, and tried to look quite happy and very impatient to begin, as we drew near to the mill, and heard louder and louder the gushing of many waters all around it. Leading the way immediately to a place beneath the falling stream, where there was a deep, eddying pool, Mr. Garthwaite baited and then threw in his line before I had fixed the joints of my fishing rod. This first difficulty overcome, I involuntarily plunged into some excellent, but rather embarrassing, sport with my line and hook. I caught every one of my garments, from head to foot. I angled for my own clothes with the dexterity and success of Isaac Walton himself. I caught my hat, my jacket, my waistcoat, my trousers, my fingers, and my thumbs. Some devil possessed my hook. Some more than eel-like vitality twirled and twisted in every inch of my line. By the time my host arrived to assist me, I had attached myself to my fishing rod, apparently for life. All difficulties yielded, however, to his patience and skill. My hook was baited for me and thrown in, my rod was put into my hand, my friend went back to his place, and we began at last to angle in earnest. We certainly caught a few fish. In my case, I mean, of course, that the fish caught themselves. But they were scanty in number and light in weight. Whether it was the presence of the miller's foreman, a gloomy personage who stood staring disastrously upon us from a little flower garden on the opposite bank, that cast an adverse influence over our sport, or whether my want of faith and earnestness as an angler acted retributively on my companion as well as myself, I know not. But it is certain that he got almost as little reward for his skill as I got for my patience. After nearly 2 hours of intense expectation on my part and intense angling on his, Mr. Garthwaite jerked his line out of the water in a rage and bade me follow him to another place, declaring that the stream must have been netted by poachers in the night, who had taken all the large fish away with them and had thrown in the small ones to grow until their next visit. We moved away, further down the bank, leaving the imperturbable foreman still in the flower garden, staring at us speechlessly on our departure, exactly as he had already stared at us on our approach. "Stop a minute," said Mr. Garthwaite suddenly, after we had walked some distance in silence by the side of the stream. "I have an idea. Now, we are out for a day's angling, we won't be balked. Instead of trying the water here again, we will go where I know by experience that the fishing is excellent. And, what is more, you shall be introduced to a lady whose appearance is sure to interest you, and whose history, I can tell you beforehand, is a very remarkable one." "Indeed?" I said. "May I ask in what way?" "She is connected," answered Mr. Garthwaite, "with an extraordinary story which relates to a family once settled in an old house in this neighbourhood. Her name is Miss Welwyn, but she is less formally known among the poor people about here, who love her dearly and honour her almost superstitiously, as the Lady of Glenwith Grange. Wait till you have seen her before you ask me to say anything more. She lives in the strictest retirement. I am almost the only visitor who is admitted. Don't say you had rather not go in. Any friend of mine will be welcome at the Grange, the scene of the story, remember, for my sake, the more especially because I have never abused my privilege of introduction. The place is not above 2 miles from here, and the stream, which we call in our county dialect Glenwith Beck, runs through the grounds. As we walked on, Mr. Garthwaite's manner altered. He became unusually silent and thoughtful. The mention of Miss Welwyn's name had evidently called up some recollections which were not in harmony with his everyday mood. Feeling that to talk to him on any indifferent subject would be only to interrupt his thoughts to no purpose, I walked by his side in perfect silence, looking out already with some curiosity and impatience for a first view of Glenwith Grange. We stopped, at last, close by an old church, standing on the outskirts of a pretty village. The low wall of the churchyard was bounded on one side by a plantation, and was joined by a park paling, in which I noticed a small wicket gate. Mr. Garthwaite opened it, and led me along a shrubbery path, which conducted us circuitously to the dwelling-house. We had evidently entered by a private way, for we approached the building by the back. I looked up at it curiously, and saw, standing at one of the windows on the lower floor, a little girl watching us as we advanced. She seemed to be about 9 or 10 years old. I could not help stopping a moment to look up at her. Her clear complexion and her long dark hair were so beautiful. And yet there was something in her expression, a dimness and vacancy in her large eyes, a changeless, unmeaning smile on her parted lips, which seemed to jar with all that was naturally attractive in her face, which perplexed, disappointed, and even shocked me, though I hardly knew why. Mr. Garthwaite, who had been walking along thoughtfully with his eyes on the ground, turned back when he found me lingering behind him, looked up to where I was looking, started a little, I thought, and then took my arm, whispered rather impatiently, "Don't say anything about having seen that poor child when you are introduced to Miss Welwyn. I'll tell you why afterwards," and led me round hastily to the front of the building. It was a very dreary old house, with a lawn in front thickly sprinkled with flower beds, and creepers of all sorts climbing in profusion about the heavy stone porch and the mullions of the lower windows. In spite of these prettiest of all ornaments clustering brightly round the building, in spite of the perfect repair in which it was kept from top to bottom, there was something repellent to me in the aspect of the whole place. A deathly stillness hung over it, which fell oppressively on my spirits. When my companion rang the loud, deep-toned bell, the sound startled me as if we had been committing a crime in disturbing the silence. And when the door was opened by an old female servant, while the hollow echo of the bell was still vibrating in the air, I could hardly imagine it possible that we should be let in. We were admitted, however, without the slightest demur. I remarked that there was the same atmosphere of dreary repose inside the house which I had already observed, or rather felt, outside it. No dogs barked at our approach, no doors banged in the servants' offices, no heads peeped over the banisters. Not one of the ordinary domestic consequences of an unexpected visit in the country met either eye or ear. The large, shadowy apartment, half library, half breakfast room, into which we were ushered, was as solitary as the hall of entrance, unless I accept such drowsy evidences of life as were here presented to us, in the shape of an Angola cat and a grey parrot. The first lying asleep in a chair, the second sitting ancient, solemn, and voiceless in a large cage. Mr. Garthwaite walked to the window when we entered, without saying a word. Determining to let his taciturn humour have its way, I asked him no questions, but looked around the room to see what information it could give me, and rooms often do give such information, about the character and habits of the owner of the house. 2 tables covered with books were the first objects that attracted me. On approaching them, I was surprised to find that the all-influencing periodical literature of the present day, whose sphere is already almost without limit, whose readers even in our time may be numbered by millions, was entirely unrepresented on Miss Welwyn's table. Nothing modern, nothing contemporary in the world of books presented itself. Of all the volumes beneath my hand, not one bore the badge of the circulating library or wore the flaring modern livery of gilt cloth. Every work that I took up had been written at least 15 or 20 years since. The prints hanging round the walls, towards which I next looked, were all engraved from devotional subjects by the old masters. The music stand contained no music of later date than the compositions of Haydn and Mozart. Whatever I examined besides told me, with the same consistency, the same strange tale. The owner of these possessions lived in a bygone time, lived among old recollections and old associations, a voluntary recluse from all that was connected with the passing day. In Miss Welwyn's house, the stir, the tumult, the idle business of the world evidently appealed in vain to sympathies which grew no longer with the growing hour. As these thoughts were passing through my mind, the door opened and the lady herself appeared. She looked certainly past the prime of life, longer past it, as I afterwards discovered, than she really was. But I never remember in any other face to have seen so much of the better part of the beauty of early womanhood still remaining as I saw in hers. Sorrow had evidently passed over the fair, calm countenance before me, but had left resignation there as its only trace. Her expression was still youthful, youthful in its kindness and its candour especially. It was only when I looked at her hair, that was now growing grey, at her wan, thin hands, at the faint lines marked round her mouth, at the sad serenity of her eyes, that I fairly detected the mark of age, and, more than that, the token of some great grief, which had been conquered, but not banished. Even from her voice alone, from the peculiar uncertainty of its low, calm tones when she spoke, it was easy to conjecture that she must have passed through sufferings at some time of her life, which had tried to the quick the noble nature that they could not subdue. Mr. Garthwaite and she met each other almost like brother and sister. It was plain that the friendly intimacy between them had been of a very long duration. Our visit was a short one. The conversation never advanced beyond the commonplace topics suited to the occasion. It was, therefore, from what I saw, and not from what I heard, that I was enabled to form my judgment of Miss Welwyn. Deeply as she had interested me, far more deeply than I at all know how to explain in fitting words, I cannot say that I was unwilling to depart when we rose to take leave. Though nothing could be more courteous and more kind than her manner towards me during the whole interview, I could still perceive that it cost her some effort to repress in my presence the shades of sadness and reserve which seemed often ready to steal over her. And I must confess that when I once or twice heard the half-sigh stifled and saw the momentary relapse into thoughtfulness suddenly restrained, I felt an indefinable awkwardness in my position which made me ill at ease, which set me doubting whether, as a perfect stranger, I had done right in suffering myself to be introduced where no new faces could awaken either interest or curiosity, where no new sympathies could ever be felt, no new friendships ever be formed. As soon as we had taken leave of Miss Welwyn, and were on our way to the stream in her grounds, I more than satisfied Mr. Garthwaite that the impression the lady had produced on me was of no transitory kind, by overwhelming him with questions about her, not omitting one or two incidental inquiries on the subject of the little girl whom I had seen at the back window. He only rejoined that his story would answer all my questions, and that he would begin to tell it as soon as we had arrived at Glenwith Beck and were comfortably settled to fishing. 5 minutes more of walking brought us to the bank of the stream, and showed us the water running smoothly and slowly, tinged with the softest green lustre from the reflections of trees which almost entirely arched it over. Leaving me to admire the view at my ease, Mr. Garthwaite occupied himself with the necessary preparations for angling, baiting my hook as well as his own. Then, desiring me to sit near him on the bank, he at last satisfied my curiosity by beginning his story. I shall relate it in his own manner, and, as nearly as possible, in his own words. The Lady of Glenwith Grange. I have known Miss Welwyn long enough to be able to bear personal testimony to the truth of many of the particulars which I am now about to relate. I knew her father and her younger sister Rosamond, and I was acquainted with the Frenchman who became Rosamond's husband. These are the persons of whom it will be principally necessary for me to speak. They are the only prominent characters in my story. Miss Welwyn's father died some years since. I remember him very well, though he never excited in me, or in anyone else that I ever heard of, the slightest feeling of interest. When I have said that he inherited a very large fortune, amassed during his father's time, by speculations of a very daring, very fortunate, but not always very honourable kind, and that he bought this old house with the notion of raising his social position by making himself a member of our landed aristocracy in these parts, I have told you as much about him, I suspect, as you would care to hear. He was a thoroughly commonplace man, with no great virtues and no great vices in him. He had a little heart, a feeble mind, an amiable temper, a tall figure, and a handsome face. More than this need not and cannot be said on the subject of Mr. Welwyn's character. I must have seen the late Mrs. Welwyn very often as a child, but I cannot say that I remember anything more of her than that she was tall and handsome, and very generous and sweet-tempered towards me when I was in her company. She was her husband's superior in birth, as in everything else, was a great reader of books in all languages, and possessed such admirable talents as a musician that her wonderful playing on the organ is remembered and talked of to this day among the old people in our country houses about here. All her friends, as I have heard, were disappointed when she married Mr. Welwyn, rich as he was, and were afterwards astonished to find her preserving the appearance, at least, of being perfectly happy with a husband who, neither in mind or heart, was worthy of her. It was generally supposed, and I have no doubt correctly, that she found her great happiness and her great consolation in her little girl Ida, now the lady from whom we have just parted. The child took after her mother from the first, inheriting her mother's quick sensibilities, and, more than all, her mother's quiet firmness, patience, and loving kindness of disposition. From Ida's earliest years, Mrs. Welwyn undertook the whole superintendence of her education. The two were hardly ever apart, within doors or without. Neighbours and friends said that the little girl was being brought up too fancifully, was not enough among other children, was sadly neglected as to all reasonable and practical teaching, and was perilously encouraged in those dreamy and imaginative tendencies of which she had naturally more than her due share. There was, perhaps, some truth in this, and there might have been still more if Ida had possessed an ordinary character, or had been reserved for an ordinary destiny. But she was a strange child from the first, and a strange future was in store for her. Little Ida reached her 11th year without either brother or sister to be her playfellow and companion at home. Immediately after that period, however, her sister Rosamond was born. Though Mr. Welwyn's own desire was to have a son, There were, nevertheless, great rejoicings yonder in the old house on the birth of this second daughter. But they all turned, only a few months afterwards, to the bitterest grief and despair. The Grange lost its mistress. While Rosamond was still an infant in arms, her mother died. Mrs. Welwyn had been afflicted with some disorder after the birth of her second child, the name of which I am not learned enough in medical science to be able to remember. I only know that she recovered from it, to all appearance, in an unexpectedly short time, that she suffered a fatal relapse, and that she died a lingering and painful death. Mr. Welwyn, who in after years had a habit of vaingloriously describing his marriage as a love match on both sides, was really fond of his wife in his own frivolous, feeble way, and suffered as acutely as such a man could suffer during the latter days of her illness, and at the terrible time when the doctors, one and all, confessed that her life was a thing to be despaired of. He burst into irrepressible passions of tears, and was always obliged to leave the sick-room whenever Mrs. Welwyn spoke of her approaching end. The last solemn words of the dying woman, the tenderest messages that she could give, the dearest parting wishes that she could express, the most earnest commands that she could leave behind her, the gentlest reasons for consolation that she could suggest to the survivors among those who loved her, were not poured into her husband's ear, but into her child's. From the first period of her illness, Ida had persisted in remaining in the sick-room, rarely speaking, never showing outwardly any signs of terror or grief, except when she was removed from it, and then bursting into hysterical passions of weeping, which no expostulations, no arguments, no commands, nothing, in short, but bringing her back to the bedside, ever availed to calm. Her mother had been her playfellow, her companion, her dearest and most familiar friend, and there seemed something in the remembrance of this which, instead of overwhelming the child with despair, strengthened her to watch faithfully and bravely by her dying parent to the very last. When the parting moment was over, and when Mr. Welwyn, unable to bear the shock of being present in the house of death at the time of his wife's funeral, left home and went to stay with one of his relations in a distant part of England, Ida, whom it had been his wish to take away with him, petitioned earnestly to be left behind. "I promised Mamma before she died that I would be as good to my little sister Rosamond as she had been to me," said the child simply, "and she told me in return that I might wait here and see her laid in her grave." There happened to be an aunt of Mrs. Welwyn, and an old servant of the family, in the house at this time, who understood Ida much better than her father did, and they persuaded him not to take her away. I have heard my mother say that the effect of the child's appearance at the funeral on her, and on all who went to see it, was something that she could never think of without the tears coming into her eyes, and could never forget to the last day of her life. It must have been very shortly after this period that I saw Ida for the first time. I remember accompanying my mother on a visit to the old house we have just left, in the summer, when I was at home for the holidays. It was a lovely, sunshiny morning. There was nobody indoors, and we walked out into the garden. As we approached that lawn yonder, on the other side of the shrubbery, I saw first a young woman in mourning, apparently a servant, sitting reading, then a little girl, dressed all in black, moving towards us slowly over the bright turf, and holding up before her a baby whom she was trying to teach to walk. She looked, to my ideas, so very young to be engaged in such an occupation as this, and her gloomy black frock appeared to be such an unnaturally grave garment for a mere child of her age, and looked so doubly dismal by contrast with the brilliant sunny lawn on which she stood, that I quite started when I first saw her, and eagerly asked my mother who she was. The answer informed me of the sad family story, which I have just been relating to you. Mrs. Welwyn had then been buried about 3 months, and Ida, in her childish way, was trying, as she had promised, to supply her mother's place to her infant sister Rosamond. I only mention this simple incident because it is necessary, before I proceed to the eventful part of my narrative, that you should know exactly in what relation the sisters stood towards one another from the first. Of all the last parting words that Mrs. Welwyn had spoken to her child, none had been oftener repeated, none more solemnly urged, than those which had commended the little Rosamond to Ida's love and care. To other persons, the full, the all-trusting dependence which the dying mother was known to have placed in a child hardly 11 years old seemed merely a proof of that helpless desire to cling even to the feeblest consolations which the approach of death so often brings with it. But the event showed that the trust so strangely placed had not been ventured vainly when it was committed to young and tender hands. The whole future existence of the child was one noble proof that she had been worthy of her mother's dying confidence when it was first reposed in her. In that simple incident which I have just mentioned, the new life of the 2 motherless sisters was all foreshadowed. Time passed. I left school, went to college, travelled in Germany, and stayed there some time to learn the language. At every interval, when I came home and asked about the Welwyns, the answer was, in substance, almost always the same. Mr. Welwyn was giving his regular dinners, performing his regular duties as county magistrate, enjoying his regular recreations as an amateur farmer and an eager sportsman. His 2 daughters were never separate. Ida was the same strange, quiet, retiring girl that she had always been, and was still, as the phrase went, spoiling Rosamond in every way which it was possible for an elder sister to spoil a younger by too much kindness. I myself went to the Grange occasionally when I was in this neighbourhood, in holiday and vacation time, and was able to test the correctness of the picture of life there which had been drawn for me. I remember the 2 sisters when Rosamond was 4 or 5 years old, and when Ida seemed to me, even then, to be more like the child's mother than her sister. She bore with her little caprices as sisters do not bear with one another. She was so patient at lesson time, so anxious to conceal any weariness that might overcome her in play hours, so proud when Rosamond's beauty was noticed, so grateful for Rosamond's kisses when the child thought of bestowing them, so quick to notice all that Rosamond did, and to attend all that Rosamond said, even when visitors were in the room, that she seemed, to my boyish observations, altogether different from other elder sisters in other family circles into which I was then received. I remember them again when Rosamond was just growing to womanhood, and was in high spirits at the prospect of spending a season in London and being presented at court. She was very beautiful at that time, much handsomer than Ida. Her accomplishments were talked of far and near in our country circles. Few, if any, of the people, however, who applauded her playing and singing, who admired her watercolour drawings, who were delighted at her fluency when she spoke French, and amazed at her ready comprehension when she read German, knew how little of all this elegant mental cultivation and nimble manual dexterity she owed to her governesses and masters, and how much to her elder sister. It was Ida who really found out the means of stimulating her when she was idle. Ida who helped her through all her worst difficulties. Ida who gently conquered her defects of memory over her books, her inaccuracies of ear at the piano, her errors of taste when she took the brush or pencil in hand. It was Ida alone who worked these marvels, and whose all-sufficient reward for her hardest exertions was a chance word of kindness from her sister's lips. Rosamond was not unaffectionate, and not ungrateful, but she inherited much of her father's commonness and frivolity of character. She became so accustomed to owe everything to her sister, to resign all her most trifling difficulties to Ida's ever-ready care, to have all her tastes consulted by Ida's ever-watchful kindness, that she never appreciated, as it deserved, the deep, devoted love of which she was the object. When Ida refused 2 good offers of marriage, Rosamond was as much astonished as the various strangers, who wondered why the elder Miss Welwyn seemed bent on remaining single all her life. When the journey to London, to which I have already alluded, took place, Ida accompanied her father and sister. If she had consulted her own tastes, she would have remained in the country, but Rosamond declared that she should feel quite lost and helpless 20 times a day in town without her sister. It was in the nature of Ida to sacrifice herself to anyone whom she loved, on the smallest occasions as well as the greatest. Her affection was as intuitively ready to sanctify Rosamond's slightest caprices as to excuse Rosamond's most thoughtless faults. So she went to London cheerfully, to witness with pride all the little triumphs won by her sister's beauty, to hear, and never tire of hearing, all that admiring friends could say in her sister's praise. At the end of the season, Mr. Welwyn and his daughters returned for a short time to the country, then left home again to spend the latter part of the autumn and the beginning of the winter in Paris. They took with them excellent letters of introduction, and saw a great deal of the best society in Paris, foreign as well as English. At one of the first of the evening parties which they attended, the general topic of conversation was the conduct of a certain French nobleman, the Baron Franval, who had returned to his native country after a long absence, and was spoken of in terms of high eulogy by the majority of the guests present. The history of who Franval was, and of what he had done, was readily communicated to Mr. Welwyn and his daughters, and was briefly this. The Baron inherited little from his ancestors besides his high rank and his ancient pedigree. On the death of his parents, he and his 2 unmarried sisters, their only surviving children, found the small territorial property of the Franvals in Normandy barely productive enough to afford a comfortable subsistence for the 3. The Baron, then a young man of 23, endeavoured to obtain such military or civil employment as might become his rank, but though the Bourbons were at that time restored to the throne of France, his efforts were ineffectual. Either his interest at court was bad, or secret enemies were at work to oppose his advancement. He failed to obtain even the slightest favour, and, irritated by undeserved neglect, resolved to leave France and seek occupation for his energies in foreign countries, where his rank would be no bar to his bettering his fortunes, if he pleased, by engaging in commercial pursuits. An opportunity of the kind that he wanted unexpectedly offered itself. He left his sisters in care of an old male relative of the family at the chateau in Normandy, and sailed, in the first instance, to the West Indies, afterwards extending his wanderings to the continent of South America, and there engaging in mining transactions on a very large scale. After 15 years of absence, during the latter part of which time false reports of his death had reached Normandy, he had just returned to France, having realised a handsome independence, with which he proposed to widen the limits of his ancestral property, and to give his sisters, who were still, like himself, unmarried, all the luxuries and advantages that affluence could bestow. The Baron's independent spirit and generous devotion to the honour of his family and the happiness of his surviving relatives were themes of general admiration in most of the social circles of Paris. He was expected to arrive in the capital every day, and it was naturally enough predicted that his reception in society there could not fail to be of the most flattering and most brilliant kind. The Welwyns listened to this story with some little interest, Rosamond, who was very romantic, being especially attracted by it. and openly avowing to her father and sister, when they got back to their hotel, that she felt as ardent a curiosity as anybody to see the adventurous and generous Baron. The desire was soon gratified. Franval came to Paris, as had been anticipated, was introduced to the Welwyns, met them constantly in society, made no favourable impression on Ida, but won the good opinion of Rosamond from the first, and was regarded with such high approval by their father that when he mentioned his intention of visiting England in the spring of the new year, he was cordially invited to spend the hunting season at Glenwith Grange. I came back from Germany about the same time that the Welwyns returned from Paris, and at once set myself to improve my neighbourly intimacy with the family. I was very fond of Ida, more fond perhaps than my vanity will now allow me to, but that is of no consequence. It is much more to the purpose to tell you that I heard the whole of the Baron's story enthusiastically related by Mr. Welwyn and Rosamond, that he came to the Grange at the appointed time, that I was introduced to him, and that he produced as unfavourable an impression upon me as he had already produced upon Ida. It was whimsical enough, but I really could not tell why I disliked him, though I could account very easily, according to my own notions, for his winning the favour and approval of Rosamond and her father. He was certainly a handsome man, as far as features went. He had a winning gentleness and a graceful respect in his manner when he spoke to women, and he sang remarkably well, with one of the sweetest tenor voices I ever heard. These qualities alone were quite sufficient to attract any girl of Rosamond's disposition, and I certainly never wondered why he was a favourite of hers. Then, as to her father, the Baron was not only fitted to win his sympathy and regard in the field by proving himself an ardent sportsman and an excellent rider, but was also, in virtue of some of his minor personal peculiarities, just the man to gain the friendship of his host. Mr. Welwyn was as ridiculously prejudiced as most weak-headed Englishmen are on the subject of foreigners in general. In spite of his visit to Paris, the vulgar notion of a Frenchman continued to be his notion, both while he was in France and when he returned from it. Now, the Baron was as unlike the traditional Monsieur of English songs, plays, and satires as a man could well be, and it was on account of his very dissimilarity that Mr. Welwyn first took a violent fancy to him, and then invited him to his house. Franval spoke English remarkably well, wore neither beard, mustachios, or whiskers, kept his hair cut almost unbecomingly short, dressed in the extreme of plainness and modest good taste, talked little in general society, uttered his words when he did speak with singular calmness and deliberation, and to crown all, had the greater part of his acquired property invested in English securities. In Mr. Welwyn's estimation, such a man as this was a perfect miracle of a Frenchman, and he admired and encouraged him accordingly. I have said that I disliked him, yet could not assign a reason for my dislike, and I can only repeat it now. He was remarkably polite to me. We often rode together in hunting, and sat near each other at the Grange table, but I could never become familiar with him. He always gave me the idea of a man who had some mental reservation in saying the most trifling thing. There was a constant restraint, hardly perceptible to most people, but plainly visible nevertheless to me, which seemed to accompany his lightest words, and to hang about his most familiar manner. This, however, was no just reason for my secretly disliking and distrusting him as I did. Ida said as much to me, I remember, when I confessed to her what my feelings towards him were, and tried, but vainly, to induce her to be equally candid with me in return. She seemed to shrink from the tacit condemnation of Rosamond's opinion with such a confidence on her part which such a confidence on her part would have implied. And yet she watched the growth of that opinion, or, in other words, the growth of her sister's liking for the Baron, with an apprehension and sorrow which she tried fruitlessly to conceal. Even her father began to notice that her spirits were not so good as usual, and to suspect the cause of her melancholy. I remember he jested, with all the dense insensibility of a stupid man, about Ida having invariably been jealous from a child if Rosamond looked kindly upon anybody except her elder sister. The spring began to get far advanced towards summer. Franval paid a visit to London, came back in the middle of the season to Glenwith Grange, wrote to put off his departure for France, and at last, not at all to the surprise of anybody who was intimate with the Welwyns, proposed to Rosamond, and was accepted. He was candour and generosity itself when the preliminaries of the marriage settlement were under discussion. He quite overpowered Mr. Welwyn and the lawyers with references, papers, and statements of the distribution and extent of his property, which were found to be perfectly correct. His sisters were written to, and returned the most cordial answers, saying that the state of their health would not allow them to come to England for the marriage, but adding a warm invitation to Normandy for the bride and her family. Nothing, in short, could be more straightforward and satisfactory than the Baron's behaviour, and the testimonies to his worth and integrity which the news of the approaching marriage produced from his relatives and his friends. The only joyless face at the Grange now was Ida's. At any time it would have been a hard trial to her to resign that first and foremost place which she had held since childhood in her sister's heart, as she knew she must resign it when Rosamond married. But secretly disliking and distrusting Franval as she did, the thought that he was soon to become the husband of her beloved sister filled her with a vague sense of terror which she could not explain to herself, which it was imperatively necessary that she should conceal, and which, on those very accounts, became a daily and hourly torment to her that was almost more than she could bear. One consolation alone supported her. Rosamond and she were not to be separated. She knew that the Baron secretly disliked her as much as she disliked him. She knew that she must bid farewell to the brighter and happier part of her life on the day when she went to live under the same roof with her sister's husband, but, true to the promise made years and years ago by her dying mother's bed, true to the affection which was the ruling and beautiful feeling of her whole existence, she never hesitated about indulging Rosamond's wish, when the girl, in her bright, light-hearted way, said that she could never get on comfortably in the married state unless she had Ida to live with her and help her just the same as ever. The Baron was too polite a man even to look dissatisfied when he heard of the proposed arrangement, and it was therefore settled from the beginning that Ida was to always live with her sister. The marriage took place in the summer, and the bride and bridegroom went to spend their honeymoon in Cumberland. On their return to Glenwith Grange, a visit to the Baron's sisters in Normandy was talked of, but the execution of this project was suddenly and disastrously suspended by the death of Mr. Welwyn from an attack of pleurisy. In consequence of this calamity, the projected journey was of course deferred, and when the autumn and the shooting season came, the Baron was unwilling to leave the well-stocked preserves of the Grange. He seemed, indeed, to grow less and less inclined, as time advanced, for the trip to Normandy, and wrote excuse after excuse to his sisters when letters arrived from them urging him to pay the promised visit. In the winter-time, he said he would not allow his wife to risk a long journey. In the spring, his health was pronounced to be delicate. In the genial summer-time, the accomplishment of the proposed visit would be impossible, for at that period the Baroness expected to become a mother. Such were the apologies which Franval seemed almost glad to be able to send to his sisters in France. The marriage was, in the strictest sense of the term, a happy one. The Baron, though he never altogether lost the strange restraint and reserve of his manner, was, in his quiet, peculiar way, the fondest and kindest of husbands. He went to town occasionally on business, but always seemed glad to return to the Baroness. He never varied in the politeness of his bearing towards his wife's sister. He behaved with the most courteous hospitality towards all the friends of the Welwyns. In short, he thoroughly justified the good opinion which Rosamond and her father had formed of him when they first met at Paris. And yet no experience of his character thoroughly reassured Ida. Months passed on quietly and pleasantly, and still that secret sadness, that indefinable, unreasonable apprehension on Rosamond's account, hung heavily on her sister's heart. At the beginning of the first summer months, a little domestic inconvenience happened, which showed the Baroness, for the first time, that her husband's temper could be seriously ruffled, and that by the veriest trifle. He was in the habit of taking in 2 French provincial newspapers, one published at Bordeaux and the other at Havre. He always opened these journals the moment they came, looked at one particular column of each with the deepest attention for a few minutes, then carelessly threw them aside into his waste-paper basket. His wife and her sister were at first rather surprised at the manner in which he read his 2 papers, but they thought no more of it when he explained that he only took them in to consult them about French commercial intelligence, which might occasionally be of importance to him. These papers were published weekly. On the occasion to which I have just referred, the Bordeaux paper came on the proper day, as usual, but the Havre paper never made its appearance. This trifling circumstance seemed to make the Baron seriously uneasy. He wrote off directly to the country post office and to the newspaper agent in London. His wife, astonished to see his tranquillity so completely overthrown by so slight a cause, tried to restore his good humour by jesting with him about the missing newspaper. He replied by the first angry and unfeeling words that she had heard issue from his lips. She was then within about 6 weeks of her confinement, and very unfit to bear harsh answers from anybody, least of all from her husband. On the 2nd day no answer came. On the afternoon of the 3rd, the Baron rode off to the post town to make inquiries. About an hour after he had gone, a strange gentleman came to the Grange and asked to see the Baroness. On being informed that she was not well enough to receive visitors, he sent up a message that his business was of great importance, and that he would wait downstairs for a second answer. On receiving this message, Rosamond turned, as usual, to her elder sister for advice. Ida went downstairs immediately to see the stranger. What I am now about to tell you of the extraordinary interview which took place between them, and of the shocking events that followed it, I have heard from Miss Welwyn's own lips. She felt unaccountably nervous when she entered the room. The stranger bowed very politely, and asked in a foreign accent if she were the Baroness Franval. She set him right on this point, and told him she attended to all matters of business for the Baroness, adding that, if his errand at all concerned her sister's husband, the Baron was not then at home. The stranger answered that he was aware of it when he called, and that the unpleasant business on which he came could not be confided to the Baron, at least in the first instance. She asked why. He said he was there to explain, and expressed himself as feeling greatly relieved at having to open his business to her, because she would doubtless be best able to prepare her sister for the bad news that he was, unfortunately, obliged to bring. The sudden faintness which overcame her as he spoke those words prevented her from addressing him in return. He poured out some water for her from a bottle which happened to be standing on the table, and asked if he might depend on her fortitude. She tried to say yes, but the violent throbbing of her heart seemed to choke her. He took a foreign newspaper from his pocket, saying that he was a secret agent of the French police, that the paper was the Havre Journal for the past week, and that it had been expressly kept from reaching the Baron, as usual, through his, the agent's, interference. He then opened the newspaper and begged that she would nerve herself sufficiently for her sister's sake to read certain lines which would give her some hint of the business that brought him there. He pointed to the passage as he spoke. It was among the shipping entries, and was thus expressed. Arrived de Berenice from San Francisco with a valuable cargo of hides. She brings one passenger, the Baron Franval of Chateau Franval in Normandy. As Miss Welwyn read the entry, her heart, which had been throbbing violently but the moment before, seemed suddenly to cease from all action, and she began to shiver, though it was a warm June evening. The agent held the tumbler to her lips and made her drink a little of the water, entreating her very earnestly to take courage and listen to him. He then sat down and referred again to the entry, every word he uttered seeming to burn itself in for ever, as she expressed it, on her memory and her heart. He said, "It has been ascertained beyond the possibility of doubt that there is no mistake about the name in the lines you have just read, and it is as certain as that we are here that there is only one Baron Franval now alive. The question, therefore, is whether the passenger by the Berenice is the true Baron, or, I beg you most earnestly to bear with me and to compose yourself, or the husband of your sister. The person who arrived last week at Havre was scouted as an impostor by the ladies at the chateau, the moment he presented himself there as their brother, returning to them after 16 years of absence. The authorities were communicated with, and I and my assistants were instantly sent for from Paris. We wasted no time in questioning the supposed impostor. He either was, or affected to be, in a perfect frenzy of grief and indignation. We just ascertained from competent witnesses that he bore an extraordinary resemblance to the real Baron, and that he was perfectly familiar with places and persons in and about the chateau. We just ascertained that, and then proceeded to confer with the local authorities, and to examine their private entries of suspected persons in their jurisdiction, ranging back over a past period of 20 years or more. One of the entries thus consulted contained these particulars: Hector Auguste Monbrun, son of a respectable proprietor in Normandy, well educated, gentlemanlike manners, on bad terms with his family, character, bold, cunning, unscrupulous, self-possessed, is a clever mimic, may be easily recognized by his striking likeness to the Baron Franval, imprisoned at 20 for theft and assault. Miss Welwyn saw the agent look up at her after he had read this extract from the police book, to ascertain if she was still able to listen to him. He asked, with some appearance of alarm, as their eyes met, if she would like some more water. She was just able to make a sign in the negative. He took a second extract from his pocket-book and went on. He said, "The next entry under the same name was dated 4 years later, and ran thus: H. A. Monbrun, condemned to the galleys for life, for assassination, and other crimes not officially necessary to be here specified. Escaped from custody at Toulon. Is known, since the expiration of his first term of imprisonment, to have allowed his beard to grow, and to have worn his hair long, with the intention of rendering it impossible for those acquainted with him in his native province to recognize him, as heretofore, by his likeness to the Baron Franval." There were more particulars added, not important enough for extract. We immediately examined the supposed impostor, for, if he was Monbrun, we knew that we should find on his shoulder the 2 letters of the convict brand, T.F., standing for Travaux Forcés. After the minutest examination with the mechanical and chemical tests used on such occasions, not the slightest trace of the brand was to be found. The moment this astounding discovery was made, I started to lay an embargo on the forthcoming numbers of the Havre Journal for that week, which were about to be sent to the English agent in London. I arrived at Havre on Saturday, the morning of publication, in time to execute my design. I waited there long enough to communicate by telegraph with my superiors in Paris, then hastened to this place. What my errand here is, you may—" He might have gone on speaking for some moments longer, but Miss Welwyn heard no more. Her first sensation of returning consciousness was the feeling that water was being sprinkled on her face. Then she saw that all the windows in the room had been set wide open to give her air, and that she and the agent were still alone. At first she felt bewildered, and hardly knew who he was, but he soon recalled to her mind the horrible realities that had brought him there, by apologizing for not having summoned assistance when she fainted. He said it was of the last importance, in Franval's absence, that no one in the house should imagine that anything unusual was taking place in it. Then, after giving her an interval of a minute or two to collect what little strength she had left, he added that he would not increase her sufferings by saying anything more just then on the shocking subject of the investigation which it was his duty to make, that he would leave her to recover herself, and to consider what was the best course to be taken with the Baroness in the present terrible emergency, and that he would privately return to the house between 8 and 9 o'clock that evening, ready to act as Miss Welwyn wished, and to afford her and her sister any aid and protection of which they might stand in need. With these words he bowed, and noiselessly quitted the room. For the first few awful minutes after she was left alone, Miss Welwyn sat helpless and speechless, utterly numbed in heart and mind and body. Then a sort of instinct, she was incapable of thinking, seemed to urge her to conceal the fearful news from her sister as long as possible. She ran upstairs to Rosamond's sitting-room and called through the door, for she dared not trust herself in her sister's presence, that the visitor had come on some troublesome business from their late father's lawyers, and that she was going to shut herself up and write some long letters in connection with that business. After she had got into her own room, she was never sensible of how time was passing, never conscious of any feeling within her except a baseless, helpless hope that the French police might yet be proved to have made some terrible mistake, until she heard a violent shower of rain come on a little after sunset. The noise of the rain, and the freshness it brought with it in the air, seemed to awaken her, as if from a painful and fearful sleep. The power of reflection returned to her. Her heart heaved and bounded with an overwhelming terror as the thought of Rosamond came back vividly to it. Her memory recurred despairingly to the long past day of her mother's death, and to the farewell promise she had made by her mother's bedside. She burst into an hysterical passion of weeping that seemed to be tearing her to pieces. In the midst of it, she heard the clatter of a horse's hoofs in the courtyard, and knew that Rosamond's husband had come back. Dipping her handkerchief in cold water and passing it over her eyes as she left the room, she instantly hastened to her sister. Fortunately, the daylight was fading in the old-fashioned chamber that Rosamond occupied. Before they could say 2 words to each other, Franval was in the room. He seemed violently irritated, said that he had waited for the arrival of the mail, that the missing newspaper had not come by it, that he had got wet through, that he felt a shivering fit coming on, and that he believed he had caught a violent cold. His wife anxiously suggested some simple remedies. He roughly interrupted her, saying there was but one remedy, the remedy of going to bed, and so left them without another word. She just put her handkerchief to her eyes, said softly to her sister, "How he is changed," then spoke no more. They sat silent for half an hour or longer. After that, Rosamond went affectionately and forgivingly to see how her husband was. She returned, saying that he was in bed and in a deep, heavy sleep, and predicting hopefully that he would wake up quite well the next morning. In a few minutes more the clock struck 9, and Ida heard the servant's step ascending the stairs. She suspected what his errand was, and went out to meet him. Her presentiment had not deceived her. The police agent had arrived, and was waiting for her downstairs. He asked her if she had said anything to her sister, or had thought of any plan of action, the moment she entered the room, and on receiving a reply in the negative, inquired further if the Baron had come home yet. She answered that he had, that he was ill and tired and vexed, and that he had gone to bed. The agent asked in an eager whisper if she knew that he was asleep and alone in bed, and when he received her reply, said that he must go up to the bedroom directly. She began to feel the faintness coming over her again, and with it sensations of loathing and terror that she could neither express to others nor define to herself. He said that if she hesitated to let him avail himself of this unexpected opportunity, her scruples might lead to fatal results. He reminded her that if the Baron were really the convict Montbrun, the claims of society and of justice demanded that he should be discovered by the first available means, and that if he were not, if some inconceivable mistake had really been committed, then such a plan for getting immediately at the truth as was now proposed would ensure the delivery of an innocent man from suspicion, and at the same time spare him the knowledge that he had ever been suspected. This last argument had its effect on Miss Welwyn. The baseless, helpless hope that the French authorities might yet be proved to be in error, which she had already felt in her own room, returned to her now. She suffered the agent to lead her upstairs. He took the candle from her hand when she pointed to the door, opened it softly, and, leaving it ajar, went into the room. She looked through the gap with a feverish, horror-struck curiosity. Franval was lying on his side in a profound sleep, with his back turned towards the door. The agent softly placed the candle upon a small reading table between the door and the bedside, softly drew down the bedclothes a little way from the sleeper's back, then took a pair of scissors from the toilette table, and very gently and slowly began to cut away, first the loose folds, then the intervening strips of linen from the part of Franval's nightgown that was over his shoulders. When the upper part of his back had been bared in this way, the agent took the candle and held it near the flesh. Miss Welwyn heard him exclaim some word under his breath, then saw him looking round to where she was standing and beckoning her to come in. Mechanically she obeyed. Mechanically she looked down where his finger was pointing. It was the convict Montbrun. There, just visible under the bright light of the candle, were the fatal letters T.F. branded on the villain's shoulder. Though she could neither move nor speak, the horror of this discovery did not deprive her of her consciousness. She saw the agent softly draw up the bedclothes again into their proper position, replace the scissors on the toilet table, and take from it a bottle of smelling salts. She felt him removing her from the bedroom and helping her quickly downstairs, giving her the salts to smell by the way. When they were alone again, he said, with the first appearance of agitation that he had yet exhibited, "Now, madam, for God's sake, collect all your courage and be guided by me. You and your sister had better leave the house immediately. Have you any relatives in the neighbourhood with whom you could take refuge?" They had none. "What is the name of the nearest town where you could get good accommodation for the night?" "Harleybrook." He wrote the name down on his tablet. "How far off is it?" 12 miles. "You had better have the carriage out at once, to go there with as little delay as possible, leaving me to pass the night here. I will communicate with you tomorrow at the principal hotel. Can you compose yourself sufficiently to be able to tell the head servant, if I ring for him, that he is to obey my orders till further notice?" The servant was summoned, and received his instructions. the agent going out with him to see that the carriage was got ready quietly and quickly. Miss Welwyn went upstairs to her sister. How the fearful news was first broken to Rosamond, I cannot relate to you. Miss Welwyn has never confided to me, has never confided to anybody, what happened at the interview between her sister and herself that night. I can tell you nothing of the shock they both suffered, except that the younger and the weaker died under it, that the elder and the stronger has never recovered from it, and never will. They went away that same night, with one attendant to Harleybrook, as the agent had advised. Before daybreak, Rosamond was seized with the pains of premature labour. She died 3 days after, unconscious of the horror of her situation, wandering in her mind about past times, and singing old tunes that Ida had taught her as she lay in her sister's arms. The child was born alive, and lives still. You saw her at the window as we came in the back way to the Grange. I surprised you, I dare say, by asking you not to speak of her to Miss Welwyn. Perhaps you noticed something vacant in the little girl's expression. I am sorry to say her mind is more vacant still. If idiot did not sound like a mocking word, however tenderly and pityingly one may wish to utter it, I should tell you that the poor thing had been an idiot from her birth. You will doubtless want to hear what happened at Glenwith Grange. Hear now what happened at Glenwith Grange after Miss Welwyn and her sister had left it. I have seen the letter which the police agent sent the next morning to Harleybrook, and, speaking from my recollection of that, I shall be able to relate all you can desire to know. First, as to the history of the scoundrel Montbrun, I need only tell you that he was identical with an escaped convict, who, for a long term of years, had successfully eluded the vigilance of the authorities all over Europe, and in America as well. In conjunction with 2 accomplices, he had succeeded in possessing himself of large sums of money by the most criminal means. He also acted secretly as the banker of his convict brethren, whose dishonest gains were all confided to his hands for safe keeping. He would have been certainly captured on venturing back to France, along with his 2 associates, but for the daring imposture in which he took refuge, and which, if the true Baron Franval had really died abroad, as was reported, would, in all probability, never have been found out. Besides his extraordinary likeness to the Baron, he had every other requisite for carrying on his deception successfully. Though his parents were not wealthy, he had received a good education. He was so notorious for his gentlemanlike manners among the villainous associates of his crimes and excesses that they nicknamed him the Prince. All his early life had been passed in the neighbourhood of the Château Franval. He knew what were the circumstances which had induced the Baron to leave it. He had been in the country to which the Baron had emigrated. He was able to refer familiarly to persons and localities, at home and abroad, with which the Baron was sure to be acquainted. And lastly, he had an expatriation of 15 years to plead for him as his all-sufficient excuse if he made any slight mistakes before the Baron's sisters in his assumed character of their long-absent brother. It will be, of course, hardly necessary for me to tell you, in relation to this part of the subject, that the true Franval was immediately and honourably reinstated in the family rights of which the impostor had succeeded for a time in depriving him. According to Montbrun's own account, he had married poor Rosamond purely for love, and the probabilities certainly are that the pretty, innocent English girl had really struck the villain's fancy for the time, and that the easy, quiet life he was leading at the Grange pleased him, by contrast with his perilous and vagabond existence of former days. What might have happened if he had time enough to grow wearied of his ill-fated wife and his English home, it is now useless to inquire. What really did happen on the morning when he awoke after the flight of Ida and her sister can briefly be told. As soon as his eyes opened, they rested on the police agent, sitting quietly by the bedside, with a loaded pistol in his hand. Montbrun knew immediately that he was discovered, but he never for an instant lost the self-possession for which he was famous. He said he wished to have 5 minutes allowed him to deliberate quietly in bed whether he should resist the French authorities on English ground, and so gain time by obliging the one government to apply specially to have him delivered up by the other, or whether he should accept the terms officially offered to him by the agent, if he quietly allowed himself to be captured. He chose the latter course. It was suspected because he wished to communicate personally with some of his convict associates in France, whose fraudulent gains were in his keeping, and because he felt boastfully confident of being able to escape again, whenever he pleased. Be his secret motives, however, what they might, he allowed the agent to conduct him peaceably from the Grange, first writing a farewell letter to poor Rosamond, full of heartless French sentiment and glib sophistries about fate and society. His own fate was not long in overtaking him. He attempted to escape again, as it had been expected he would, and was shot by the sentinel on duty at the time. I remember hearing that the bullet entered his head and killed him on the spot. My story is done. It is 10 years now since Rosamond was buried in the churchyard yonder, and it is 10 years also since Miss Welwyn returned to be the lonely inhabitant of Glenwith Grange. She now lives but in the remembrances that it calls up before her of her happier existence of former days. There is hardly an object in the old house which does not tenderly and solemnly remind her of the mother whose last wishes she lived to obey, of the sister whose happiness was once her dearest earthly care. Those prints that you noticed on the library walls, Rosamond used to copy in the past time, when her pencil was often guided by Ida's hand. Those music books that you were looking over, she and her mother have played from together, through many a long and quiet summer's evening. She has no ties now to bind her to the present, but the poor child whose affliction it is her constant effort to lighten, and the little peasant population around her, whose humble cares and wants and sorrows she is always ready to relieve. Far and near her modest charities have penetrated among us, and far and near she is heartily beloved and blessed in many a labourer's household. There is no poor man's hearth, not in this village only, but for miles away from it as well, at which you would not be received with the welcome given to an old friend if you only told the cottagers that you knew of the Lady of Glenwith Grange. The end. I hope we enjoyed that one. So the moral of that story is listen to your older sisters, and go with the vibes you get. If you get bad vibes from someone, probably a reason. But yes, that took slightly longer than expected. So I will throw us to a break, and hopefully the next story will be slightly shorter. So go have a break, and we will be back in about 5 minutes. Bye for now. And we're back. Hello. Welcome back. I see people are sharing things. I wonder what that could possibly be. Thank you. You're all very kind. I don't know if Sam can find the text for the next one. But we're gonna go straight into the next one, I think, because we're running a bit behind schedule, because that was a long story. And yes, as you all have noticed, took about a fair run up at the actual story there. But I wanted to include like the beginning bit simply because it was very funny to me. Aha, is that the one? I shall pin this. Thank you very much, Andy Pants. What was the thing? Yes, I particularly liked the description of him being bad at fishing, and saying that he fished for his various items of clothing. I did enjoy that. I thought that was fun. But yes, shall we continue? Let us continue with The Man with the Cough by Mary Molesworth. I am a German by birth and descent. My name is Schmidt. But by education I am quite as much an Englishman as a Deutscher, and by affection much more the former. My life has been spent pretty equally between the two countries, and I flatter myself I speak both languages without any foreign accent. I count England my headquarters now. It is home to me. But a few years ago I was resident in Germany, only going over to London now and then on business. I will not mention the town where I lived. It is unnecessary to do so, and in the peculiar experience I am about to relate, I think real names of people and places are just as well, or better, avoided. I was connected with a large and important firm of engineers. I had been bred up to the profession, and was credited with a certain amount of talent. And I was considered, and with all modesty I think I deserved the opinion, steady and reliable, so that I had already attained a fair position in the house, and was looked upon as a rising man. But I was still young, and not quite so wise as I thought myself. I came very near once to making a great mess of a certain affair. It is this story which I am going to tell. Our house went in largely for patents, rather too largely, some thought. But the head partner's son was a bit of a genius in his way, and his father was growing old, and let Herr Wilhelm, Moritz we will call the family name, do pretty much as he chose. And on the whole, Herr Wilhelm did well. He was cautious, and he had the benefit of the still greater caution and larger experience of Herr Gerhardt, the second partner in the firm. Patents and the laws which regulate them are queer things to have to do with. No one who has not had personal experience on the complications that arise could believe how far these spread and how entangled they become. Great acuteness as well as caution is called for if you would guide your patent back safely to port, and perhaps more than anything, the power of holding your tongue. As demonstrated by Joey, not. I was no chatterbox, nor, when on a mission of importance, did I go about looking as if I were bursting with secrets, which is, in my opinion, almost as dangerous as revealing them. No one, to meet me on the journeys which it often fell to my lot to undertake, would have guessed that I had anything on my mind but an easy-going young fellow's natural interest in his surroundings, though many a time I have stayed awake through a whole night of railway travel, if at all doubtful about my fellow passengers, or not dared to go to sleep in a hotel without a ready-loaded revolver by my pillow. For now and then, though not through me, our secrets did ooze out. And if, as has happened, they were secrets connected with government orders or contracts, there was, or but for the exertion of the greatest energy intact on the part of my superiors, there would have been, to put it plainly, the devil to pay. One morning, it was nearing the end of November, I was sent for to Herr Wilhelm's private room. There I found him and Herr Gerhardt before a table spread with papers covered with figures and calculations and sheets of beautifully executed diagrams. "Lutz," said Herr Wilhelm. He had known me from childhood and often called me by the abbreviation of my Christian name, which is Ludwig or Louis. "Lutz, we are going to confide to you a matter of extreme importance. You must be prepared to start for London tomorrow." "All right, sir," I said. "I shall be ready." "You will take the express through to Calais. On the whole, it is the best route, especially at this season. By travelling all night you will catch the boat there and arrive in London so as to have a good night's rest and be clear-headed for work the next morning." I bowed agreement, but ventured to make a suggestion. "If, as I infer, the matter is one of great importance," I said, would it not be well for me to start sooner? I can— yes," throwing a rapid survey over the work I had before me for the next 2 days, "I can be ready tonight." Herr Wilhelm looked at Herr Gerhardt. Herr Gerhardt shook his head. "No," he replied, "tomorrow it must be." And then he proceeded to explain to me why. I need not attempt to give all the details of the matter with which I was entrusted. Indeed, to lay readers it would be impossible. Suffice to say, the whole concerned a patent, that of a very remarkable and wonderful invention, which it was hoped and believed the governments of both countries would take up. But to secure this being done in a thoroughly satisfactory manner, it was necessary that our firm should go about it in concert with an English house of first-rate standing. To this house, the firm of Messrs. Bluestone and Fagg I will call them, I was to be sent with full explanations. And the next half-hour or more passed in my superiors going minutely into the details, so as to satisfy themselves that I understood. The mastering of the whole was not difficult, for I was well grounded technically, and like many of the best things, the idea was essentially simple, and the diagrams were perfect. When the explanations were over, and my instructions duly noted, I began to gather together the various sheets, which were all numbered. But, to my surprise, Herr Gerhardt, looking over me, withdrew 2 of the most important diagrams, without which the others were valueless, because inexplicable. "Stay," he said. "These 2, Ludwig, must be kept separate. These we send today, by registered post, direct to Bluestone and Fagg. They will receive them a day before they see you, and with them a letter announcing your arrival." I looked up in some disappointment. I had known of precautions of the kind being taken, but usually when the employee sent was less reliable than I believed myself to be. Still, I scarcely dared to demur. "Do you think that necessary?" I said respectfully. "I can assure you that from the moment you entrust me with the papers they shall never quit me day or night. And if there were any postal delay, you say time is valuable in this case, or if the papers were stolen in the transit, such things have happened, my whole mission would be worthless." "We do not doubt your zeal and discretion, my good Schmidt," said Herr Gerhardt, "but in this case we must take even extra precautions. I had not meant to tell you, fearing to add to the certain amount of nervousness and strain unavoidable in such a case, but still, perhaps it is best that you should know that we have reason for some special anxiety. It has been hinted to us that some breath of this," and he tapped the papers, "has reached those who are always on the watch for such things. We cannot be too careful." "And yet," I persisted, "you would trust the post?" "We do not trust the post," he replied. "Even if these diagrams were tampered with, they would be perfectly useless. And tampered with they will not be. But even supposing anything so wild, the rogues in question knowing of your departure, and they are more likely to know of it than of our package by post, were they in collusion with some traitor in the post office, are sharp enough to guess the truth, that we have made a Masonic secret of it. The 2 separate diagrams are valueless without your papers. Your papers reveal nothing without numbers 7 and 13. I bowed in submission. But I was, all the same, disappointed, as I said, and a trifle mortified. Herr Wilhelm saw it, and cheered me up. "All right, Lutz, my boy," he said. "I feel just like you. Nothing I should enjoy more than a rush over to London, carrying the whole documents, and prepared for a fight with anyone who tried to get hold of them. But Herr Gerhardt here is cooler-blooded than we are." The elder man smiled. "I don't doubt your readiness to fight, nor Ludwig's either, but it would be by no such honestly brutal means as open robbery that we should be outwitted. Make friends readily with no one while travelling, Lutz, yet avoid the appearance of keeping yourself aloof. You understand?" "Perfectly," I said. "I shall sleep well tonight, so as to be prepared to keep awake throughout the journey." The papers were then carefully packed up. Those consigned to my care were to be carried in a certain light black handbag with a very good lock, which had often before been my travelling companion. And the following evening I started by the express train agreed upon. So, at least, I have always believed, but I have never been able to bring forward a witness to the fact of my train at the start being the right one, as no one came with me to see me off. For it was thought best that I should depart in as unobtrusive a manner as possible, as, even in a large town such as ours, the members and employees of an old and important house like the Moritzes were well known. I took my ticket then, registering no luggage, as I had none but what I easily carried in my hand, as well as the bag. It was already dusk, if not dark, and there was not much bustle in the station, nor apparently many passengers. I took my place in an empty second-class compartment, and sat there quietly till the train should start. A few minutes before it did so, another man got in. I was somewhat annoyed at this, as in my circumstances nothing was more undesirable than travelling alone with one other. Had there been a crowded compartment, or one with 3 or 4 passengers, I would have chosen it, but at the moment I got in, the carriages were all either empty, or but with 1 or 2 occupants. Now, I said to myself, I should have done better to wait till nearer the time of departure, and then chosen my place. I turned to reconnoitre my companion, but I could not see his face clearly, as he was half leaning out of the window. Was he doing so on purpose? I said to myself, for naturally I was in a suspicious mood. And as the thought struck me, I half started up, determined to choose another compartment. Suddenly a peculiar sound made itself heard. My companion was coughing. He drew his head in, covering his face with his hand, as he coughed again. You never heard such a curious cough. It was more like a hen clucking than anything I can think of. Once, twice he coughed. Then, as if he had been waiting for the slight spasm to pass, he sprang up, looked eagerly out of the window again, and, opening the door, jumped out with some exclamation, as if he had just caught sight of a friend. And in another moment or two, he could barely have had time to get in elsewhere. Much to my satisfaction, the train moved off. Now, thought I can make myself comfortable for some hours. We do not stop till M. It will be 9 o'clock by then. If no one gets in there, I am safe to go through till tomorrow alone. Then there will only be the junction and a clear run to Calais. I unstrapped my rug and lit a cigar. Of course I had chosen a smoking carriage, and, delighted at having got rid of my clucking companion, the time passed pleasantly till we pulled up at M. The delay there was not great, and to my enormous satisfaction no one molested my solitude. Evidently the express to Calais was not in very great demand that night. I now felt so secure that, notwithstanding my intention of keeping awake all night, my innermost consciousness had not, I suppose, quite resigned itself to the necessity, for, not more than an hour or so after leaving M, possibly sooner, I fell fast asleep. It seemed to me that I had slept heavily, for when I awoke I had great difficulty in remembering where I was. Only by slow degrees did I realise that I was not in my comfortable bed at home, but in a chilly, ill-lighted railway carriage. Chilly, yes, that it was, very chilly. But as my faculties returned, I remembered my precious bag, and forgot all else in a momentary terror that it had been taken from me. No, there it was. My elbow had been pressed against it as I slept. But how was this? The train was not in motion. We were standing in a station, a dingy, deserted-looking place, with no cheerful noise or bustle, only one or two porters slowly moving about, with a sort of sleepy, night-duty, surly air. It could not be the junction. I looked at my watch. Barely midnight. Of course not the junction. We were not due there till 4 o'clock in the morning or so. What then were we doing here, and what was here? Had there been an accident, some unforeseen necessity for stopping? At that moment a curious sound, from some yards' distance only it seemed to come, caught my ear. It was that croaking, cackling cough. The cough of my momentary fellow passenger, towards whom I had felt an instinctive aversion. I looked out of the window. There was a refreshment room just opposite, dimly lighted like everything else, and in the doorway, as if just entering, was a figure which I felt pretty sure was that of the man with the cough. Bah! I said to myself, I must not be fanciful. I dare say the fellow's all right. He is evidently in the same hole as myself. What in heaven's name are we waiting here for? I sprang out of the carriage, nearly tumbling over a porter slowly passing along. "How long are we to stay here?" I cried. "When do we start again for—" and I named the junction. "For—" he repeated, in the queerest German I ever heard. Was it German, or did I discover his meaning by some preternatural cleverness of my own? "There is no train for 4 or 5 hours, not till—" and he named the time, and leaning forward lazily, he took out my larger bag and my rug, depositing them on the platform. He did not seem the least surprised at finding me there. I might have been there for a week, it seemed to me. "No train for 5 hours? Are you mad?" I said. He shook his head and mumbled something, and it seemed to me that he pointed to the refreshment room opposite. Gathering my things together, I hurried thither, hoping to find some more reliable authority. But there was no one there except a fat man with a white apron who was cleaning the counter. And yes, in one corner was the figure I had mentally dubbed the man with the cough. I addressed the cook or waiter, whichever he was, but he only shook his head, denied all knowledge of the trains, but informed me that, in other words, I must turn out. He was going to shut up. "And where am I to spend the night, then?" I said angrily, though clearly it was not the aproned individual who was responsible for the position in which I found myself. There was a restauration, he informed me, near at hand, which I should find still open, straight before me on leaving the station, and then a few doors to the right I would see the lights. Clearly there was nothing else to be done. I went out, and as I did so, the silent figure in the corner rose also and followed me. The station was evidently going to bed. As I passed the porter, I repeated the hour he had named, adding, "That is the first train for the junction." He nodded, again naming the exact time. But I cannot do so, as I have never been able to recollect it. I trudged along the road. There were lamps, though very feeble ones, but by their light I saw that the man who had been in the refreshment room was still a few steps behind me. It made me feel slightly nervous, and I looked around furtively once or twice. The last time I did so he was not to be seen, and I hoped he had gone some other way. The restauration was scarcely more inviting than the station refreshment room. It, too, was very dimly lighted, and the 1 or 2 attendants seemed half asleep and were strangely silent. There was a fire of a kind, and I seated myself at a small table near it and asked for some coffee, which would, I thought, serve the double purpose of warming me and keeping me awake. It was brought me in silence. I drank it and felt the better for it. But there was something so gloomy and unsociable, so queer and almost weird about the whole aspect and feeling of the place, that a sort of irritable resignation took possession of me. "If these surly folk won't speak, neither will I," I said to myself childishly. And, incredible as it may sound, I did not speak. I think I paid for the coffee, but I am not quite sure. I know I never asked what I had meant to ask, the name of the town, a place of some importance to judge by the size of the station and the extent of the twinkling lights I had observed as I made my way to the restauration. From that day to this, I have never been able to identify it, and I am quite sure I never shall. What was there peculiar about the coffee? Or was it something peculiar about my own condition that caused it to have the unusual effect I now experienced? That question, too, I cannot answer. All I remember is feeling a sensation of irresistible drowsiness creeping over me, mental or moral, I may say, as well as physical. For when one part of me feebly resisted the first onslaught of sleep, something seemed to reply, "Oh, nonsense! You have several hours before you. Your papers are all right. No one can touch them without awaking you." And, dreamily conscious that my belongings were on the floor at my feet, the bag itself actually resting against my ankle, my scruples silenced themselves in an extraordinary way. I remember nothing more, save a vague consciousness through all my slumber of confused and chaotic dreams, which I have never been able to recall. I awoke at last, and with that a start, almost a jerk. Something had awakened me. A sound. And as it was repeated to my now aroused ears, I knew that I had heard it before, off and on, during my sleep. It was the extraordinary cough. I looked up. Yes, there he was, at some 2 or 3 yards distance only, at the other side of the fireplace, which, and this I have forgotten to mention as another peculiar item in that night's peculiar experiences, considering I have every reason to believe I was still in Germany, was not a stove but an open grate. And he had not been there when I first fell asleep. To that I was prepared to swear. He must have come sneaking in after me, I thought, and in all probability I should neither have noticed nor recognised him but for that traitorous cackle of his. Now, my misgivings aroused, my first thought, of course, was for my precious charge. I stooped. There were my rugs, my larger bag, but no, not the smaller one, and though the other 2 were there, I knew at once that they were not quite in the same position, not so close to me. Horror seized me. Half wildly I gazed around, when my silent neighbour bent towards me. I could declare there was nothing in his hand when he did so, and I could declare as positively that I had already looked under the small round table beside which I sat, and that the bag was not there. And yet, when the man, with a slight cackle, caused no doubt by his stooping, raised himself, the thing was in his hand. Was he a conjurer, a pupil of Maskelyne and Cooke? And how was it that, even as he held out my missing property, he managed, and that most cleverly and unobtrusively, to prevent my catching sight of his face? I did not see it then. I never did see it. Something he murmured, to the effect that he supposed the bag was what I was looking for. In what language he spoke I know not. It was more that by the action accompanying the mumbled sounds I gathered his meaning, than that I heard anything articulate. I thanked him, of course, mechanically, so to say, though I began to feel as if he were an evil spirit haunting me. I could only hope that the splendid lock to the bag had defied all curiosity, but I felt in a fever to be alone again. and able to satisfy myself that nothing had been tampered with. The thought recalled my wandering faculties. How long had I been asleep? I drew out my watch. Heavens! It was close upon the hour named for the first train in the morning. I sprang up, collected my things, and dashed out of the restauration. If I had not paid for my coffee before, I certainly did not pay for it then. Besides my haste, there was another reason for this. There was no one to pay to. Not a creature was to be seen in the room or at the door as I passed out, always excepting the man with the cloth. As I left the place and hurried along the road, a bell began, not to ring, but to toll. It sounded most uncanny. What it meant, of course, I have never known. It may have been a summons to the work people of some manufactory. It may have been like all the other experiences of that strange night. But no, this theory I will not at present enter upon. Dawn was not yet breaking, but there was in one direction a faint suggestion of something of the kind not far off. Otherwise all was dark. I stumbled along as best I could, helped in reality, I suppose, by the ugly yellow glimmer of the woebegone street or road lamps. And it was not far to the station, though somehow it seemed farther than when I came, and somehow, too, it seemed to have grown steep, though I could not remember having noticed any slope the other way on my arrival. A nightmare-like sensation began to oppress me. I felt as if my luggage was growing momentarily heavier and heavier, as if I should never reach the station, and to this was joined the agonizing terror of missing the train. I made a desperate effort. Cold as it was, the beads of perspiration stood out upon my forehead as I forced myself along, and by degrees the nightmare feeling cleared off. I found myself entering the station at a run, just as, yes, a train was actually beginning to move. I dashed, baggage and all, into a compartment. It was empty, and it was a second-class one, precisely similar to the one I had occupied before. It might have been the very same one. The train gradually increased its speed, but for the first few moments, while still in the station and passing through its immediate entourage, another strange thing struck me. The extraordinary silence and lifelessness of all about. Not one human being did I see. No porter watching our departure with the faithful though stolid interest always to be seen on the porter's visage. I might have been alone in the train. It might have had a freight of the dead and been itself propelled by some supernatural agency, so noiselessly, so gloomily did it proceed. You will scarcely credit that I actually, and for the third time, fell asleep. I could not help it. Some occult influence was at work upon me throughout those dark hours, I am positively certain. And with the daylight, it was dispelled. For when I again awoke, I felt for the first time since leaving home completely and normally myself. Fresh and vigorous, all my faculties at their best. But nevertheless, my first sensation was a start of amazement, almost of terror. The compartment was nearly full. There were at least 5 or 6 travellers beside myself, very respectable, ordinary-looking folk, with nothing in the least alarming about them. Yet it was with a gasp of extraordinary relief that I found my precious bag in the corner beside me, where I had carefully placed it. It was concealed from view. No one, I felt assured, could have touched it without awaking me. It was broad and bright daylight. How long had I slept? "Can you tell me," I inquired of my opposite neighbour, a cheery-faced compatriot, "can you tell me how soon we get to the junction by this train? I am most anxious to catch the evening mail at Calais, and am quite out in my reckonings owing to an extraordinary delay at... I have wasted the night by getting into a stopping train instead of the express." He looked at me in astonishment. He must have thought me either mad or just awaking from a fit of intoxication. Only I flatter myself I did not look as if the latter were the case. "How soon we get to the junction?" he repeated. "Why, my good sir, you left it about 3 hours ago. It is now 8 o'clock. We all got in at the junction. You were alone, if I mistake not." He glanced at one or two of the others who endorsed his statement. "And very fast asleep you were, and must have been, not to be disturbed by the bustle at the station. And as for catching the evening boat at Calais," he burst into a loud guffaw, "why, it would be very hard lines to do no better than that. We all hope to cross by the midday one." "Then what train is this?" I exclaimed, utterly perplexed. "The express, of course. All of us, excepting yourself, joined it at the junction," he replied. "The express?" I repeated. "The express that leaves," and I named my own town, "at 6 in the evening." "Exactly. You have got into the right train after all." And here came another shout of amusement. "How did you think we had all got in if you had not yet passed the junction? You had not the pleasure of our company from M, I take it? M, which you passed at 9 o'clock last night, if my memory is correct?" "Then," I persisted, "this is the double-fast express, which does not stop between M and your junction?" "Exactly," he repeated, and then confirmed most probably in his belief that I was mad, or the other thing, he turned to his newspaper, and left me to my extraordinary cogitations. Had I been dreaming? Impossible! Every sensation, the very taste of the coffee, seemed still present with me. The curious accent of the officials at the mysterious town I could perfectly recall. I still shivered at the remembrance of the chilly waking in the Restauration. I heard again the cackling cough. But I felt I must collect myself and be ready for the important negotiation entrusted to me. And to do this, I must for the time banish these fruitless efforts at solving the problem. We had a good run to Calais, found the boat in waiting, and a fair passage brought us prosperously across the Channel. I found myself in London punctual to the intended hour of my arrival. At once I drove to the lodgings in a small street off the Strand which I was accustomed to frequent in such circumstances. I felt nervous till I had an opportunity of thoroughly overhauling my documents. The bag had been opened by the custom-house officials, but the words "private papers" had sufficed to prevent any further examination, and to my unspeakable delight they were intact. A glance satisfied me as to this the moment I got them out, for they were most carefully numbered. The next morning saw me early on my way to number 909, we will say, Blackfriars Street, where was the office of Messrs. Bluestone and Fagg. I had never been there before, but it was easy to find, and had I felt any doubt, their names stared me in the face on the side of the open doorway. 2nd floor, I thought I read, but when I reached the first landing I imagined I must have been mistaken. For there, at a door ajar, stood an eminently respectable-looking gentleman, who bowed as he saw me, with a discreet smile. "Herr Schmidt?" he said. "Ah, yes, I was on the lookout for you." I felt a little surprised, and my glance involuntarily strayed to the doorway. There was no name upon it, and it appeared to have been freshly painted. My new friend saw my glance. "Oh, it's all right," he said. "We have the painters here. We are using these lower rooms temporarily. I was watching to prevent your having the trouble of mounting to the 2nd floor." And as I followed him in, I caught sight of a painter's ladder, a small one, on the stair above, and the smell was also unmistakable. The large outer office looked bare and empty, but under the circumstances that was natural. No one was at the first glance to be seen, but behind a dulled glass partition screening off one corner, I fancied I caught sight of a seated figure. And an inner office, to which my conductor led the way, had a more comfortable and inhabited look. Here stood a younger man. He bowed politely. "Mr. Fagg, my junior," said the first individual airily. "And now, Herr Schmidt, to the business at once, if you please. Time is everything. You have all the documents ready." "Ready." I answered by opening my bag and spreading out its contents. Both men were very grave, almost taciturn, but as I proceeded to explain things, it was easy to see that they thoroughly understood all I said. "And now," I went on, when I had reached a certain point, "if you will give me numbers 7 and 13, which you have already received by registered post, I can put you in full possession of the whole. Without them, of course, all I have said is, so to say, preliminary only." The two looked at each other. "Of course," said the elder man, "I follow what you say. The key of the whole is wanting. But I was momentarily expecting you to bring it out. We have not. Fagg, I am right, am I not? We have received nothing by post." "Nothing whatever," replied his junior. And the answer seemed simplicity itself. Why did a strange thrill of misgiving go through me? Was it something in the look that had passed between them? Perhaps so. In any case, strange to say, the inconsistency between their having received no papers and yet looking for my arrival at the hour mentioned in the letter accompanying the documents, and accosting me by name, did not strike me till some hours later. I threw off what I believed to be my ridiculous mistrust, and it was not difficult to do so in my extreme annoyance. "I cannot understand it," I said. "It is really too bad. Everything depends upon 7 and 13. I must telegraph at once for inquiries to be instituted at the post office." "But your people must have duplicates," said Fagg eagerly. "These can be forwarded at once." "I hope so," I said, feeling strangely confused and worried. "They must send them direct here," he went on. I did not at once answer. I was gathering my papers together. "And in the meantime," he proceeded, touching my bag, "you had better leave these here. We will lock them up in the safe at once. It is better than carrying them about London." It certainly seemed so. I half laid down the bag on the table, but at that moment from the outer room a most peculiar sound caught my ears, a faint cackling cough. I think I concealed my start. I turned away as if considering Fagg's suggestion, which, to confess the truth, I had been on the very point of agreeing to. For it would have been a great relief to me to know that the papers were in safe custody. But now a flash of lurid light seemed to have transformed everything. "I thank you," I replied. "I should be glad to be free from the responsibility of the charge, but I dare not let these out of my own hands till the agreement is formally signed." The younger man's face darkened. He assumed a bullying tone. "I don't know how it strikes you, Mr. Bluestone," he said, "but it seems to me that this young gentleman is going rather too far. Do you think your employers will be pleased to hear of your insulting us, sir?" But the elder man smiled condescendingly, though with a touch of superciliousness. It was very well done. He waved his hand. "Stay, my dear Mr. Fagg, we can well afford to make allowance. You will telegraph at once, no doubt, Herr Schmidt, and let me see. Yes, we shall receive the duplicates of numbers 7 and 13 by first post on Thursday morning." I bowed. "Exactly," I replied as I lifted the now locked bag. "And you may expect me at the same hour on Thursday morning." Then I took my departure, accompanied to the door by the urbane individual who had received me. The telegram which I at once dispatched was not couched precisely as he would have dictated, I allow, and he would have been considerably surprised at my sending off another, later in the day, to Bluestone and Fagg's telegraphic address, in these words: "Unavoidably detained till Thursday morning, Schmidt." This was after the arrival of a wire from home in answer to mine, By Thursday morning I had had time to receive a letter from Herr Wilhelm, and to secure the services of a certain noted detective, accompanied by whom I presented myself at the appointed hour at 9:09. But my companion's services were not required. The birds had flown, warned by the same traitor in our camp through whom the first hints of the new patent had leaked out. With him it was easy to deal, poor wretch. But the clever rogues who had employed him and personated the members of the honourable firm of Bluestone and Fag were never traced. The negotiation was successfully carried out. The experience I had gone through left me a wiser man. It is to be hoped, too, that the owners of 909 Blackfriars Street were more cautious in the future as to whom they let their premises to when temporarily vacant. The repainting of the doorway, etc., at the tenant's own expense, had already roused some slight suspicion. It is needless to add that numbers 7 and 13 had been duly received on the second floor. I have never known the true history of that extraordinary night. Was it all a dream, or a prophetic vision of warning? Or was it in any sense true? Had I, in some inexplicable way, left my own town earlier than I intended, and really travelled in a slow train? Or had the man with the cough, for his own nefarious purposes, mesmerised or hypnotised me, and to some extent succeeded? I cannot say. Sometimes even I ask myself if I am quite sure that there ever was such a person as the man with the cough. The end. Ooh, I like that one. I think that's a fun one in terms of sort of, yeah, not a ghost story, old-timey corporate espionage. Exactly. With a bit of spookums thrown in. Yeah, I quite like that one. That was fun. But yes, I hope you all enjoyed. Sorry it's dragged on a little longer than expected. I think possibly I will not raid tonight because I am tired, it is warm, and late. So, yeah. We should be back, hopefully on Saturday, with more Three Men in a Boat, which I'm sure we are all looking forward to. I know I certainly am. So yeah, we shall probably see you then. Probably not going to raid over to Stephen, but if you want someone else to watch, go watch Stephen, because we like him. He's good people. Yes, thank you all very much for being here. You're all wonderful people, and yeah, go take care of yourselves and be good to everyone, and yeah, we shall see you on Saturday. So thank you very much, and goodbye.